I've been deceived about Anne of Cleves. She is nothing like what was reported to me. Nothing! She looks like a horse! A Flanders Mare!
He called her a Flanders Mare. She was nothing like her portrait. For centuries, Anne of Cleves has been remembered as the ugly wife, the one who catfished the king, a bride who deceived her husband. But was she really ugly? Or was it the painter, Hans Holbein, famous for capturing realistic portraits, who dared to mislead the king? Or maybe it was all in Henry's head, an illusion born of vanity, obsession, and pride. Was Anne truly at fault, or was the king hiding a darker secret behind his anger? History remembered Anne as the failed queen, but behind the nicknames, insults, and rumors lies a deeper truth, a story of misunderstanding, survival, and a woman who quietly outlived a king obsessed with appearances. In this video, we'll uncover not just the infamous first meeting and the annulment, but the psychological reasons behind Henry's intense hatred, and explore Anne's life after divorce, her royal retirement, her wealth, her influence without a crown, and how she quietly outshone the tragic fates of Henry's other wives. Welcome back to History Untold. I'm Alex, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past. If these untold stories speak to you, hit the like button and join our family. Let's step into the past together. Hans Holbein arrived in Cleves in 1539 with one mission: paint a bride for the King of England. Henry had never met Anne. Everything he knew of her came through diplomats, ambassadors, and one painting. Holbein wasn't just any painter. He was Henry's court artist, trusted to capture truth on canvas. His portraits were known for their precision, their unflinching realism. When Holbein painted Thomas More, you could see the weariness in his eyes. When he painted Henry himself, he didn't hide the king's aging face or expanding waist. Holbein painted what he saw. That was his reputation. That was his power. But this time, Holbein wasn't painting for posterity. He was painting for politics. The marriage between Henry and Anne wasn't about love. It was about an alliance. This marriage was Thomas Cromwell's arrangement, a man who needed this deal to work far more than the king himself. A shield against Catholic France and Spain. Cromwell had staked everything on Henry saying yes. So when Holbein set up his easel in Cleves, he wasn't just painting a woman, he was painting a treaty. Anne sat for the portrait in her finest gown, stiff brocade, heavy embroidery, a headdress that framed her face in the German style. Holbein worked quickly, capturing her features with his usual precision. She wasn't a legendary beauty, but she wasn't unpleasant either. She was ordinary. And that was the problem. Because when the portrait arrived in England, Henry spent hours looking at it. He was captivated. Anne of Cleves looked elegant, graceful, composed, the kind of woman worthy of a king. Cromwell praised her virtue. The ambassadors praised her warmth. Everyone who had anything to gain from this marriage seemed to agree. Anne of Cleves was everything Henry could want. And Anne herself? She never made a single promise about her appearance. She never wrote flattering letters. She never described herself as beautiful. She sat for the portrait and waited. The painting did the rest. Henry fell in love with an image carefully constructed by men with everything to lose. He convinced himself it was real. He built a fantasy around brushstrokes and political ambition and called it a bride. He had married a portrait. He was about to meet a person. And the gap between those two things was about to destroy everything. January 1st, 1540, Rochester, England. Henry VIII couldn't wait any longer. Anne of Cleves was traveling toward London for their wedding, scheduled for January 6th. She was staying at the Bishop's Palace in Rochester, resting after her journey from the continent. Henry, impatient and bursting with romantic delusion, decided to surprise her. He had done this before. Years earlier, he had disguised himself to surprise Catherine of Aragon, convinced she would recognize her true love beneath the costume. It had worked. Henry remembered that moment as proof of his irresistible charm. He wanted to recreate it. So he dressed in plain clothes, gathered a small group of companions, and rode to Rochester. He planned to burst into Anne's chamber, reveal himself, and witness her delight. In his imagination, she would gasp, blush, and fall at his feet in adoration. It would be the beginning of their great love story. Reality had other plans. When Henry entered the room, Anne was watching a bear baiting from the window. She turned, saw a group of strange men in her private quarters, and froze. She didn't recognize the king. Why would she? She had never seen him before. She had no idea what he looked like in person. She only knew he was supposed to meet her in London in 5 days. So when this heavy, aging man in dirty traveling clothes approached her with a grin, she did what any sensible woman would do. She recoiled. Henry tried to kiss her. Anne turned her face away. He pressed closer, speaking in English she barely understood. She looked confused, uncomfortable, even frightened. She pulled back toward the window, clearly wishing these intruders would leave. Henry's fantasy shattered in seconds. He left the room, changed into his royal attire, and returned. This time, Anne recognized the fine clothing, the jewels, the deference of the attendants. She understood. She dropped into a curtsy, lowered her eyes, and greeted him with all the formality her upbringing demanded. But the damage was done. Henry had expected instant attraction, mutual recognition, chemistry that transcended words. What he got was a polite foreign woman who didn't swoon at his presence. She didn't blush. She didn't tremble with desire. She treated him with respect, but not adoration, and Henry VIII could not forgive that. Within hours, he was raging to Cromwell. "I like her not," he snarled. She was nothing like her portrait. Her face was different, harder, plainer, older. Her body displeased him. She had no grace, no wit, no charm. The entire arrangement was a disaster. Cromwell, terrified, tried to salvage the situation. The alliance with Cleves was critical. The wedding had been announced. Guests were arriving. Canceling now would humiliate England, enrage the Protestant princes, and leave Henry vulnerable to his Catholic enemies. But Henry wasn't thinking about politics. He was thinking about his wounded pride. He had been sold a lie. He had been deceived. Someone had to pay for that humiliation, and since he couldn't blame himself, he blamed Anne. He began calling her ugly. He told courtiers she smelled bad, though no one else noticed. He claimed she was dull, lifeless, and unattractive in every way. He said the portrait had been dishonest, the descriptions false, the whole arrangement a trick. None of it was true. Anne looked exactly like her portrait. Holbein hadn't lied. Cromwell hadn't lied. The only lie was the one Henry told himself, that a woman would love him on sight simply because he was king. But admitting that would mean admitting weakness. It would mean accepting that his age, his weight, his ulcerated leg, and his cruel reputation made him less desirable than he wanted to believe. So instead, he married her. On January 6, 1540, Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves stood before the altar. Henry's face was stone. Anne's was unreadable. They spoke their vows in front of the court, the clergy, and the foreign ambassadors who had come to witness England's new alliance. But the marriage was over before it began. Henry refused to consummate it. He told his physicians he couldn't bring himself to touch her. He spent his wedding night sulking, complaining, and planning his escape. Anne, meanwhile, simply waited. She had no idea what she had done wrong. She only knew that the King of England despised her, and soon the entire court would know it too. What Anne didn't realize yet, what no one realized, was that Henry's rejection would become the best thing that ever happened to her.
Why did Henry hate Anne so much? What turned disappointment into disgust? To understand that, you have to step inside the mind of Henry VIII in 1540. Not the king history remembers, the tyrant, the wife-killer, the man who broke with Rome. You need to see the man he saw when he looked in the mirror. And that man was still 25 years old. In Henry's mind, he was still the golden prince who had once made women swoon across Europe. He still remembered the tournaments where he'd ridden in shining armor. He remembered being tall, athletic, devastating. He remembered when women genuinely desired him, when their attraction wasn't forced by fear or duty, but real. That version of Henry lived only in his imagination, but he clung to it desperately, because the reality was unbearable. By 1540, Henry VIII was 48 years old and physically ruined. His waist measured 54 inches, nearly as wide as he was tall in his youth. His legs could barely support his weight. The ulcer on his thigh, probably caused by a jousting accident years earlier, oozed pus constantly and filled the air around him with the stench of rotting flesh. He needed servants to help him dress, to help him walk, to help him mount a horse. He was in constant pain. The ulcer never healed. Some days it hurt so badly he couldn't think straight. His physicians tried everything, poultices, leeches, prayers, but nothing worked. The wound would close for a few weeks, then burst open again worse than before, and the pain made him vicious. His temper, never mild, became explosive. He raged at servants over nothing. He turned on advisors who had served him for decades. He saw betrayal everywhere, conspiracies in every shadow. His paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. People were whispering about him, pitying him, wondering how much longer he would live. But instead of accepting his decline, Henry doubled down on the fantasy. He still threw feasts. He still wore elaborate clothing covered in jewels. He still expected to be treated like the magnificent prince of his youth. And he still believed women found him irresistible. This wasn't arrogance, it was survival. Henry's entire identity was built on being desired, being powerful, and being the greatest king England had ever known. If he admitted that his body had failed him, that his charm was gone, that women only pretended to want him because refusing a king could cost them their lives, then what was left? So he convinced himself the lie was true. He told himself that women still trembled at his touch, that his courtiers admired rather than feared him, that he was still the man he remembered being. And when Anne of Cleves arrived, he expected her to confirm that delusion. He imagined she would see past the weight, the smell, the pain, and fall at his feet for the privilege of marrying him. He convinced himself that their meeting in Rochester would be the beginning of a great romance, that she would desire him instantly. But Anne didn't know how to play that game. Anne of Cleves wasn't raised in the Tudor court. She didn't grow up watching women flirt, seduce, and manipulate their way into power. She was raised in Cleves, a small German duchy where women were taught modesty, obedience, and silence. She didn't speak English well. She didn't know English customs. She had no idea what Henry expected from her. She was a simple woman thrust into a role she didn't understand. When Henry burst into her room in disguise, she didn't recognize him as a romantic gesture. She saw strange men invading her private space. When he tried to kiss her, she didn't see a king testing her love. She saw an unwanted advance from someone she didn't know. Her reaction was natural, sensible, appropriate, but to Henry it was devastating. Because in that moment the fantasy shattered, and Henry couldn't accept that. His mind simply refused to process it. So instead of blaming himself, instead of admitting that barging into a stranger's room in disguise was absurd, he blamed her. She must be ugly, she must be dull, she must be defective in some way, because the alternative, that he was no longer desirable, was unthinkable. Henry also claimed that Anne of Cleves had tricked him, even though she had done nothing but exist. He needed her to be the villain, because he couldn't be the fool. Within months, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged the marriage, was arrested and executed. Henry blamed him for bringing Anne to England,
for forcing the match, for ruining everything. But Cromwell's real crime was simpler. He had been part of the moment when Henry's fantasy died. And Henry VIII could forgive many things, but he could never forgive being reminded that he was human. The marriage lasted 6 months. 6 months of Henry avoiding Anne, complaining about her, and searching for a way out. 6 months of Anne wondering what she had done wrong, not understanding that her only crime was failing to lie convincingly enough. Henry needed a way out, and Anne, whether she realized it or not, needed to give him one. In July 1540, just 6 months after the wedding, Henry summoned Anne to Richmond Palace. He told her the marriage would be annulled. She was not his true wife. The union had never been valid. She would step aside quietly, and in return, she would be treated generously. Anne listened. She didn't argue. She didn't weep. She didn't demand her rights or threaten to appeal to her brother or the Pope. She simply agreed. It was the smartest decision she ever made. Because Anne understood something that Henry's other wives had failed to grasp. Surviving Henry VIII meant giving him what he wanted before he took it by force. Catherine of Aragon had fought for her marriage and died in exile, broken and bitter. Anne Boleyn had tried to hold on to power and ended up on the scaffold. Anne of Cleves looked at their fates and chose a different path. She would lose the crown, but she would keep her life, and in doing so, she would gain something far more valuable than a title.
July 9th, 1540. The annulment was finalized. On paper, it was a humiliation. Anne of Cleves was no longer Queen of England. The marriage had been declared invalid on the grounds of a prior betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine, a flimsy excuse that nobody truly believed. Henry simply needed a legal reason to dissolve the union, and his bishops obediently provided one. But Anne didn't protest. She signed the documents. She wrote to her brother in Cleves, assuring him she was content with the outcome. She accepted Henry's terms without a single complaint. The court was baffled. Why wasn't she angry? Why wasn't she fighting? Because Anne understood the game better than anyone expected. In exchange for her compliance, Henry granted her an astonishing settlement. She received Richmond Palace, one of the most beautiful royal residences in England. She was given Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, along with several other estates scattered across the country. She was awarded an annual income of £4,000, making her one of the wealthiest women in the kingdom. And she was granted the honorary title of the King's beloved sister, which meant she would retain her status at court, attend royal events, and enjoy all the privileges of royalty, without the dangers that came with being Henry's wife. By agreeing to the annulment without resistance, Anne made herself non-threatening. Henry didn't see her as an enemy or a rival. He saw her as a cooperative, obedient woman who knew her place. And because she posed no threat, he had no reason to harm her. Meanwhile, Anne quietly secured her future. She didn't return to Cleves, where she would have been a disgraced failure. She stayed in England, where she was rich, independent, and safe. She attended court functions, maintained relationships with powerful nobles, and built a life that no other queen in Henry's reign ever achieved. She had no husband to obey, no king to fear, no crown to lose. The other wives had fought for power and paid the price. Anne of Cleves surrendered power and gained everything they had died trying to keep. It's easy to see her as passive, even weak. History has often portrayed her that way, the plain wife who quietly disappeared. But passive doesn't mean powerless. Anne made a calculated choice. She saw the trap that had killed others and stepped around it. And while Henry moved on to his fifth wife, Anne settled into her palaces and began living the kind of life most Tudor women could only dream of. Richmond Palace stood on the banks of the Thames, surrounded by orchards, gardens, and deer parks. It was one of Henry VIII's favorite residences,
a sprawling estate filled with tapestries, gilded furniture, and rooms large enough to host entire courts. When he gave it to Anne of Cleves, he was giving her a palace fit for a queen, and Anne made the most of it. She employed a household staff of over 100 people, servants, cooks, grooms, ladies-in-waiting, chaplains, musicians. She hosted dinners, entertained guests, and maintained the kind of lavish lifestyle that rivaled the royal court itself. Her income was more than sufficient to support her household, and she managed her estates with careful attention. But the real luxury wasn't the wealth, it was the freedom. Anne could wake up when she wanted, eat what she wanted, spend her days however she pleased. She wasn't subject to Henry's moods, his demands, or his increasingly erratic behavior. She didn't have to worry about producing an heir, maintaining his affection, or avoiding the factions and conspiracies that swirled around the Tudor court. She was, in every meaningful sense, her own person. And she used that freedom wisely. Instead of retreating into isolation, Anne stayed visible. She attended court events when invited, appeared at royal celebrations, and maintained her status as the king's beloved sister. She was always polite, always gracious, always careful to show deference to Henry and his new wives. But she never tried to reclaim her position. She never competed. She simply existed in the background, comfortable and unthreatened. And through all of it, Anne never once considered returning to Cleves. Going home would have meant arriving as a failure, a woman King of England had looked at and found wanting. In Cleves, she would have been a political embarrassment, a reminder of an alliance that collapsed. But in England, she was wealthy, respected, and free. Home had nothing to offer her that England hadn't already given her, except humiliation. So she stayed, and she built her life exactly where the king had tried to discard her. Throughout the 1540s and 1550s, Anne maintained quiet connections with the most important figures in England. She exchanged letters with nobles, attended weddings and christenings, and gave gifts to influential courtiers. She built a network of goodwill without ever making a single enemy. When Princess Mary needed support during her years of isolation under her father and brother's Protestant regimes, Anne was one of the few people who remained friendly with her. When Princess Elizabeth faced suspicion and danger during Mary's reign, Anne offered her quiet encouragement. But her life wasn't entirely without tension. In 1553, after Henry's death, his daughter Mary I became queen. Mary was a devout Catholic, and she began reversing the Protestant reforms that had defined her father's reign. Anne, who had grown up Protestant, suddenly found herself in a precarious position. On top of the religion shift, there were financial pressures too. When Henry died in 1547, Anne's generous settlement, palaces, land, and a large annual income gave her independence. But under Queen Mary, her position changed. Mary's government was cautious about large Protestant-linked estates. Some officials whispered that Anne's wealth and status were too great for a woman who had never borne a Tudor heir. Anne's lands and income were examined, her accounting audited, and she was subtly reminded that her place was not at the center of power. Mary didn't strip Anne of her holdings outright, but she did encourage Anne to stay retired from court. It was a political balancing act. Mary needed Anne's loyalty, but she also needed to show that her reign would be different from her father's, less chaotic, more controlled. So Anne adapted once again. She attended Catholic services when required, she paid formal respects to Queen Mary, she avoided religious controversy altogether. She didn't push back, she didn't argue, she simply lived in her estates, managing her properties and her income quietly, without drawing attention. And in doing that, quietly, flexibly, without threat, Anne survived. While nobles were executed, bishops burned, and the entire country convulsed with religious violence, Anne of Cleves remained untouched. She had her estates, her income, and a life of relative comfort, but it wasn't carefree. There were moments when she worried about losing favor, about her wealth being reduced, about her place in a kingdom that was shifting beneath her feet. It was a life that no one, least of all Henry or his critics, had expected her to have. And yet, despite the shifting religion, the political tensions, and the financial scrutiny, she endured. Summer 1557, Chelsea Manor, London. Anne of Cleves knew the end was near. But even in her final days, she had work to do. She dictated her will with the same precision she had brought to everything else in her life. She left 1 year's wages to every servant, a staggering act of generosity. 18 gentlewomen received specific legacies. Her foreign servants were given money for their journey home to Germany. She remembered her family in Cleves with gifts and bequests. She left her best jewel to Queen Mary I and her second best to Princess Elizabeth. Even in death, she honored the relationships she had maintained with both of Henry's daughters. And she asked Mary and Elizabeth to take her maids and staff into their own households, ensuring that the women who had served her would have positions, security, and futures. She wrote to Mary, asking the Queen to personally attend her funeral, ensuring her final passage would honor the crown. She requested Catholic rites for her burial, showing respect for Mary's faith, and perhaps, in her own quiet way, blending devotion with survival. Anne had spent a lifetime adapting, finding the balance between sincerity and pragmatism, pleasing everyone without ever compromising herself. And then, on July 16, 1557, she was gone. Anne of Cleves died peacefully in her sleep. She was 41 years old. She had outlived Henry VIII by a decade. She was buried at Westminster Abbey with full honors. Her tomb was modest but respectful, placed among nobles and royalty. No one called her a failure. No one remembered the insults Henry had hurled at her 17 years earlier. She was remembered as the king's beloved sister, as a generous patron, as a woman who had lived well and died in peace. She lost the crown, but she kept everything that mattered. There's a cruel irony in her story. Henry rejected her because she didn't make him feel loved. She didn't flatter his ego. She didn't worship him. And in doing so, she accidentally saved herself. Because the wives Henry loved, the ones who made him feel like a king, a hero, a god, were the ones he destroyed. Anne didn't try to be what Henry wanted. She didn't fight to keep a crown that would have destroyed her. She walked away, and in doing so, she won. By the time she died, she had lived longer than any of Henry's queens. She had more wealth, more freedom, more peace. She had outlasted the king who rejected her and the system that had nearly trapped her. And she did it all by being the one thing Henry VIII could never tolerate: unremarkable. History remembers her as the ugly wife, the rejected one, the failure. But Anne of Cleves was the only one of Henry's wives who got exactly what she deserved: a long life, lived on her own terms, free from the shadow of a tyrant king. So here's my question. Was Anne of Cleves the smartest of Henry's wives, or just the luckiest? Did she plan her survival, or did she simply stumble into it? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating characters. Share it with anyone who loves untold stories from the past. And if you're curious about another woman who defied expectations and reshaped history, check out this video link. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.